available. There are places that kids who have little or no resources, who don't have the greatest home place to live, those places probably have Wi-Fi. The ones that don't have it are the ones somewhere in the middle. So I'd like to know if there's, how we attack or ask who does and doesn't have Wi-Fi access, and how can we make those things available?
We can articulate the surveys we've done to date and
Perfect.
exactly what the responses are to those
That
surveys.
would be awesome. Thank you.
Go ahead, Andy. I'll go after you. That's totally fine.
I will say, though, I think it's an issue of equity and accessibility again. I mean, where I live, there's not a library within a mile.
I like your plan. I just want to know the numbers.
Right, but my point saying, if we want to say that there is accessibility in the community, yes, there is. Our community, I think, is doing a solid job of stepping up to the plate, but we have an interesting community of not, an interesting bus system and a closes off at an early time in the evening kind of bus system. So I think it's very important that we don't just say that the community can take, we've not said that, and the reason being is that there are lots of holes in accessibility.
I agree with you.
Thank you.
Matt, go ahead.
I was wondering if there was a performance difference between schools that have snacks already and those that don't. Any idea?
The committee did ask for any research that had been done on the federal program, and the federal program is really designed to promote eating fresh fruit and fresh vegetables. So their statistical analysis of it would be, does the consumption of fresh fruit and fresh vegetables increase with the program? And so that's their benchmark and their target. The answer to that was yes. But the federal program is more about increasing fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, not walking it all the way across to student achievement.
Student achievement. That's interesting. I just wonder, as we're expanding, because that's one of the things I like to know is, what's the result that we can expect out of this? And so it would be great if there was some data that connected it to student learning, but obviously that they don't have that. Another question. First of all, going back to the building fund that Lanny and several others referred to, I think it's a great move for us to be able to lower our general fund levy. I like the idea of taking advantage of fixing up some property things, maybe acquiring land, whatever it is that we end up doing with that, outside of just going back to the taxpayers and asking for another bond. So I really like that idea. The expenditures from the building fund, they just operate like anything out of our bond fund, where it would still go out for proposal, it would still come before us as action, all that sort of stuff. Is that correct?
Correct. So the thresholds for entering into a contract for the board agenda would be similar to the general fund. Those would be the same.
Okay, good. And then Barbara in her note, she said a couple things. She says that when referring to the Head Start, the preschool expending, she said, one line, she said, this moves us beyond our mission and mandate of K-12 education. And then as well, she said, this is a line item that is not directly related to our K-12 taxing authority. Are we limited to K-12, or what's the actual mandate for a school district in Lincoln, or in Nebraska?
I think she's interpreting the word mandate to be Rule 10 accreditation. That's normally what people would say with mandate. I will say that early childhood is recognized in the state aid formula, so it is recognized there. I don't believe anything in Rule 10 requires an investment in early childhood services, so that could be the interpretation of the mandate.
Right. It's a strong focus right now as a state and as a nation. It isn't a mandated service.
Okay. And it was, I guess, when we moved into pre-K, did we move into it using general funds initially, or was it just because there was Head Start dollars available that we started doing pre-K?
Early childhood has always been a graded funding stream with grants from the Nebraska Department of Ed, the early childhood expansion grants that we've applied for. There have been Sixpence dollars, there have been Head Start dollars, there have been Title I dollars, and then general fund dollars. So there's always been that graded funding behind it. And as then the state included it in the formula, I don't know what year that came in for sure, but that's one indicator where the state says this is a priority now in terms of trying to help. And then adding those expansion grants, clearly there's an emphasis, I would say. It's not a mandate, but an emphasis. And I think we know what the research says about early childhood opportunities, and we've seen the needs right here in our community, and we know that those early experiences, brain development, all of those things that we know about early learning. And the board at one point in time made it a priority in saying that we want to grow those programs. And so now we go from that point forward to determine what you'll prioritize. But a lot of things have come in along behind that. I think LPS was kind of a leader in that, and as things have progressed, there's a big emphasis on it now.
Another question related to another part of the budget, the tech plan. There was a pretty significant expenditure growth in instructional coaches for technology. I wasn't here when that technology plan was approved. Was that sort of expenditure included in the projections for the tech plan?
So the tech plan, when we presented it was that 2015, we talked about, we had a grid that walked out the equipment expenditures and some of the domains of the tech plan, which totaled the 50 million number. That number did not include instructional technology coaches. At the end of that presentation, we came back and said, what are some additional funds that will support this plan? And instructional technology coaches was called out in that presentation as one thing that would need an additional investment. We did have money earmarked in our forecast system, because that's how we plan for future expenditures, is we put money in school staffing. And what we learned from the pilot was identification of who the person is and designation of how much time they spend as a tech coach was going to vary building by building by building. So it was going to vary based on the competency of the staff, how much technology had they previously invested in, how much had they taken on. It was going to take into account the skills of the current staff as to whether they had a right fit. You might have a school that said, I really need someone new and I want to share with this school. And so we knew it would take on some nuances in school staffing, so we put it in the school staffing line. And so that's where that funding was identified. We did not designate a particular dollar amount because we didn't have it at the time of the tech plan. We just had it in the forecast so that we knew we could fund the decision.
We also saw it as helping with the return on investment, knowing that if we're going to put the Chromebooks in classrooms, we want teachers to be able to make that fundamental shift in using technology in the classroom. And what we learned from other districts that we had visited and other implementations, that coach part was a critical component in making sure that we weren't buying expensive dust.
I know we're only a couple years into it, even in some of the other places where we piloted it, but is this a permanent need? Or is this something that will change over time? Is this a couple-year thing? I mean, what's the...
What we said is we would put those coaches in place for the duration of the implementation, for sure. And at that point, then we'd begin to look and see if that's a need that we want to continue prioritizing as a budget piece, or if we want to then divert that FTE to another need that might be more apparent at that time, or if we then somehow want to work it into our staffing and then allow buildings to determine what they want to do. So we'll have some choices to make around that, but we for sure wanted to do it during implementation.
These tech coaches does this provide the tech coaches we need for all the schools, or would we assume that there would be an ask for more of this next year?
There'll be
this
more
coming
this
year?
next year
Right,
for
this
high
coming-
schools. Yep.
For this coming year, it was to make sure that all elementaries had at least a half of an FTE, a half-time person. Middle schools had a half-time person, full-time person, half-time.
Between 8 and 12 points.
Okay, around half-time, because some, depending how classes worked and who was doing it, we gave them a little bit of flex, and then a full-time person just due to the size of a high school. And so
Okay.
that's northeast and southeast for next year. So then we'll finish off the high schools next year.
So presumably it'd only be 4 full-timers next year.
Correct.
Okay.
Keeping in mind, we always monitor and adjust, so we'll see
Right,
how the
right.
staffing levels this year work. But yeah, just simple math, we'd still have the remaining 4 high schools for next year.
Okay.
Yep.
Good, thank you.
Don?
I'd like to make a comment about the early childhood because there was the idea expressed that that's outside of our K-12 mandate, and that is a perspective. My perspective is I disagree with that. I mean, you can say that our responsibility is from when, kids are between kindergarten or 12th grade, or you can say that our responsibility is to educate children and graduate them, and that's the school that I tend to fall under. And there is quite a bit of data, I think, that points to that the earlier that we start being involved with educating children before kindergarten, especially in the case of high needs children, there's quite a bit of data pointing to increases in student achievement and graduation rate. And I think the fact that that is a concept is reflected, as Liz mentioned, by the fact that that's included in state aid calculation. So from my perspective, especially for our higher needs children, I think that the early education is actually a pretty important thing and is very much within our mandate, for lack of a better word, as a public school district. The other thing that I would say, maybe by way of kind of summarizing the way that I feel about the work that we've done so far, is that there are a lot of things about this budget that I really appreciate. I mentioned a couple of the big bullet points, the building fund, the mental health staffing. One of the things, and I think we can't say it enough, is that the story of this budget and our budgets in recent years is growth. The growth here has just been incredible. And as was pointed out to me recently, the growth that we've been experiencing, close to 1,000 new students into the district every year. I think what it was, 83% of the districts in the state have less kids in their district as a whole than we are growing every year. So our growth is incredible compared to the rest of the districts in the state, to most of the rest of the districts in the state. Our size and growth are incredible. So this is something that we have to account for, not only in terms of facilities, which we've been talking about with the building fund, but also in terms of staffing resources. I appreciate that we have made the commitment to funding for growth. We went through a kind of a dry period where we weren't doing that for a while. Class sizes were starting to sneak up. People also forget that when we're talking about funding for growth, that's not just teachers in the classroom, that also could potentially be support positions for all the extra kids that we've got in our buildings. So the fact that we are accommodating all of this growth, or are trying to address all of this growth, and I think that's going to be a continuing theme in coming years. One thing that I would like to point out, there are questions of us every year, or concerns for us every year about the effect that we have on the property taxes. And, the reality is our property taxes in Lincoln and Lancaster County are high. There's no question of that, compared to a lot of other communities. But the reason for that is not because of school district spending. The property taxes are high because that's the way the system is set up. And I've been saying this for years. We've been doing our part. I think we've been doing as much as we could to ask the questions, what can we do to reduce the levy? And we've made incredible progress. I think more than any other local elected body. 7 cents in 10 years is an incredible reduction, but there's only so much that we can do. And on top of that, I would say that lowering the property taxes, and one way to think of it is that's not really our job. Our job is to make sure we're taking care of the needs of our children. Despite that, we have been making a lot of progress in reducing the property tax burden. But again, I would say that the only hope for any long-term, significant, meaningful property tax reduction is going to have to come from the legislature. The last comment that I would make, there was quite a bit of conversation last year where as we have done ever since I can remember as a board member, where we do a full valuation every 3 years, and so we get a hike in property taxes on that third year, and then there are 2 years in between where it's relatively flat. And as we've done in the past, when we had that extra money last year, we put some away. Now we're taking a little bit out. I'm not wanting to pick at anybody else, but I would point out in other school districts, in Millard, where they're having some very difficult conversations about what their budget year is going to look like. The city has been putting out some information where it looks like they're facing a shortfall, and we're not having those conversations in Lincoln. We continue to keep our levy rate relatively flat or trending downwards. When we have the money, we put it aside, we use it wisely, like was mentioned with the Journal Star editorial that came out when we did this last year. And I think that we're seeing the dividends of that this year, where we're not talking about wholesale slashing of needed programs or tax hikes. We're able to live within our means, And I think that's the definition of using that growth, whether it comes smoothly every year or whether it comes in a big chunk every 3 years. In talking with some of our colleagues from other districts across the state, they don't all have that dynamic. They get, instead of a valuation every 3 years, they get just a steady increase, if that's what's going to happen, every year. And so then, and of course, they use what is available to them as per the rules given to them by the legislature. And it doesn't get the attention that it does here because we do get that big hike. But I appreciate the fact that when we have had those funds available to us, we've put them away, we're able to use them this year and next year to make sure that, with our eye on the prize, we're taking care of the needs of our children and doing it in a way that keeps the levy rate reasonable. So that's it.
Does anyone else have any more questions? Okay, if there are any other questions, please send your emails to Dawn or Liz, and they will get back to you. If there's nothing else, we're done. Okay, we are adjourned.